the the whole this whole chapter, chapter 11, is about tying pay to outcomes, to the performance someone does in a job. There are lots of different ways to do that, and we're going to talk through um, the basic issues of pay for performance and what caused them to fail and what causes them to succeed, and then we're going to go to individual pay for performance, and then we're going to talk about group pay for performance and the different kinds of plans within those. In between, we'll talk about the legal issues that get involved in pay for performance. Pay for performance is much more popular than it used to be. It's hard to do pay for performance when people are paid to do a small piece of the job, and the outcome is not under their control. And so more and more jobs are outcome based rather than time based or doing a small piece of the job. So it's easier now to pay people on performance. You can also pay people on competencies too, and that acts much like pay for performance. So there is a strong trend to implement pay for performance systems in the last few years. Pay for performance really allows you to tie pay to the strategic plan, and that's another reason. As organizations get more strategic in their overall view and in their view of HR, they're more likely to try pay for performance systems. You can put either a portion of an employee's pay at risk or all of their pay at risk within a pay for performance system. So you can actually split it and say, this part of your job you get paid for performance and this part you don't. And so that's more common too. There are a lot of difficulties, I said that, and limitations to pay for performance systems, and organizations need to understand that. They can fail, and they usually fail miserably. Cheating is a big issue in pay for performance. So let's talk about where it works and where it doesn't work, and what are the problems in implementing. When you create a pay for performance system, you have to ask yourself what is being rewarded. You have to correlate the short-term measures with the long-term measures. You've got to be able to control both of those in a pay system. If you set pay for performance on short-term measures, you won't get the long-term measures. And for instance, if you pay a car salesman to sell cars, sure, the car salesman will sell cars, but that car salesman probably will not spend time generating new customers and following up and make sure people get the proper service on their cars and those kinds of things. They will concentrate on who walks in the door and just try to sell them a car, and they won't pay attention to the long-term aspects of the business. There are a lot of contingencies to be considered, both individual and situational, and we're going to cover those. Basically, pay for performance is successful when it's tailored to certain situations. It has to be tailored to the work situation. Often it has to be tailored to the individual, and it has to be linked to the long-term strategic objectives of the organization. There is a figure in your book. There are two figures. 11.1 is the basic issues of pay, which you should pay attention to. Figure 11.2 is the determinants of effective pay for performance systems, and that's a fairly critical part of this chapter. It really sets the stage for everything else. But in figure 11.2, it shows individual factors on one side and organizational factors on the others. I mean, the employees have to value the outcomes that are part of the pay system. The outcome has to be valued in relation to other rewards, and that could be benefits, or it could be a portion of pay that's not at risk for pay for performance. One of the really critical aspects of I'm having trouble with pay for performance, but one of the critical parts of that is that the performance must be able, you must be able to measure the performance accurately, and the employee must be have complete control of the outcome. If you can't measure the outcome and the employee isn't completely in control of the outcome, pay for performance will never work. So those are fairly critical issues. The employee has to believe in it too. If they don't trust management to count the outcomes right, the system simply won't work. The employees will hate it. The employees have to have a sense of equity, that as their performance goes up, their pay goes up. If they don't see that in the system, they won't trust it. Obviously, the size of the reward has to be large enough to impact a person's effort in the job too. So those are some of the employee factors. Organizational factors, obviously you have to have a culture that supports a pay for performance system. If the culture is to escape work and do the least amount regardless of what's going on, that's not going to support a culture for pay for performance. Employer has to have extremely competent supervisors that manage the system. Again, if the employees don't trust it, they don't trust the measuring of performance or the giving of rewards, the system will fail. The employer has to have a really good performance measurement system. Whatever the outcome is that's measured, it has to be very accurate. And it has to be fair. So there are things on both sides, individual and organizational, that are fairly critical to make this system work. Unions are becoming much more receptive to pay for performance. There are more pay for performance in team cultures now than ever before. The rest of that section I think I've basically said, so I'll skip over it. It has to be compatible with goals, and worker involvement in design is important. I did not say that. The main problems are really, you can see in 11.2, the perceived connection between performance and pay has to be there. It has to be trusted by employees. Pay for performance systems are expensive to develop and maintain. They take a lot of oversight. They have to be very objective. The outcomes have to be countable and measurable. Employees have to perceive that it's accurately measured. A lot of times you will get union resistance to creating a new system, and that's why worker involvement is so critical in the design of the system. But where you have a union, you're going to have union involvement in the design of the system. And you've got to have supervisors that take it seriously. If the supervisors aren't going to do a meticulous job of running a pay for performance system, it will not, and it will not work either. One of the things that you'll find is that employees will cheat constantly in a pay for performance system. That's why the short-term goals have to be aligned with the long-term goals. If you'll allow people to scam the system, they will. I mean, we can argue, and the book talks about this, we can argue whether cheating is inherent in the human psyche or what, but people are always trying to take advantage. I mean, people are trying to get something for free all the time. And if you create a poor pay-for-performance system, I guarantee you that the employees are going to find the holes, and they'll take advantage of that. So the two big issues for you as a manager are you have to have a really meticulous system that balances short-term and long-term goals, or you're going to get nothing but short-term goals. And then you have to have a system that works really well, measures well, it rewards well, et cetera, et cetera. And everything is spelled out and measured because the employees will find the holes and they'll find ways to cheat. And there are plenty of examples of systems that have failed. You usually see it in the press because a system has failed because they haven't balanced short and long-term goals rather than it's been an unfair system. An unfair system that the employees just will gripe and moan, and the organization will go back to an older pay system. The problem with not aligning the short and long-term goals you see in healthcare, one of the prime examples was HCA back almost 15 years ago now, 12, 13 years ago. The rewards were really placed on maximizing income from Medicare, and a lot of the hospitals started really scamming Medicare, and there's lots of ways to do that. And the federal government came down very hard on HCA, and it eventually broke the company up. The family took it back over and created a lot of systems where they weren't defrauding the government. But there are other systems. I mean, there's an example in your book of Sears. It's been about 20 years now, but Sears started paying their mechanics on an incentive system, and the mechanics started inventing all kinds of work that didn't need to be done, and turned out that 20-some states ended up suing Sears for defrauding customers, and Sears had to stop the whole system. So those are just a couple examples, but there are others. If you reward people for short-term behavior, that's what they're going to do. And if the short-term behavior is getting more customers or getting more products sold or getting more procedures done in healthcare, you will get more procedures, but you will probably get those procedures in a fraudulent way. And the easy person to scam is Medicare, and then the federal government comes after you, and you're in deep trouble. So you've got to make sure that not only is the short-term aim being rewarded, but there's a reward for not defrauding and not stealing and cheating, and that's a very hard system to put together. So. Other legal implications beside fraud and abuse, obviously pay-for-performance systems are covered by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and all of the issues of discrimination. They're covered by all of the issues of wage and hour, and that's a conflict. Overtime is an issue. Most people that are put on pay-for-performance are paid essentially as exempt employees, and so there are issues with the Wage and Hour Act. So all the other laws that we've covered so far, the Equal Pay Act applies to, apply even in a pay-for-performance system. So. What do you do to build one? Well, first of all, you figure out who's going to be included in the system. They're usually developed around specific groups with specific issues in mind. Most companies have different pay systems for different jobs, different departments, where some may be salary or some may be hourly and some may be pay for performance. If you do pay for performance, you should involve as many of the employees that are similar as possible. You don't want one similar group not paid for performance and another group paid for performance. So similar groups should all be paid the same. You want to maximize the number of people in the system because it's so costly and time consuming to build. Now Americans prefer pay for performance, and they prefer individual pay for performance systems. Europeans do not, so it's an interesting difference. But if you took the typical American worker and asked them what they wanted, they would say that they wanted an individual pay for performance. Now the problem is there's tons of jobs out there where people only do a little piece of the work and it's not an identifiable part. If you're working on an assembly line and you're putting the wiring harness in a car, for instance, the outcome is the car. It's not really that the wiring harness goes in there perfectly, because at least 20 other people will touch that wiring harness. And if you were to pay people that put the wiring harness on or in the car based on the lack of faults in the electrical system when the cars were done, that's really unfair to the individual who put the wiring harness in, because everybody that hooked up something to the wiring harness, from a radio to a light to an air conditioner, touched that system and could have screwed it up. And so you can see that there are 20 people involved in the electrical system of a car, and how do you reward one person individually with performance on pay? You don't. You pay them by the hour typically. You might give the entire assembly line a group incentive for producing more cars, but you better remember, short and long term, say producing better cars with perfect quality. Because if you say produce more cars, can they produce more cars than an assembly line? Absolutely, by lowering the time and quality spent of the work. And so that's one of the things you don't do, is you don't pay people based on producing more cars, because they absolutely will produce more cars, but that you won't be able to sell the cars. They'll have so many faults with them. So you've got to figure out who's going to be paid in the system. The second is what performance is measured, and we've talked about that. It has to be short and long-term compatible, it has to be measurable, etc. What are the rewards in the incentive system? Is it cash? Is it an increase in base pay? Is it non-cash prizes? And they're very common. There are lots of companies out there that are giving vacations or trips or something for some outcome. The next is whether you're going to do an individual or group or a company-wide pay-for-performance system. I've talked a lot about individual systems, but you can also reward a work group or a team with an incentive system, or you can include the entire company. I teach the evaluation class, which some of you may take. In last semester in that evaluation class, I had a team evaluate an incentive system in an oil and gas company, and that incentive system was that if the company doubled in size, as an oil and gas company, if it doubled in size of assets and it doubled its profit, then every individual in the company, and there were 987, something like that, would either get a car up to $50,000 of their choice, or they would get $35,000 in cash. Well, it turns out that everybody worked hard, and that year they did double their oil and gas reserves, and they did double their profit. And so the company spent $24 million giving everybody a $50,000 car. And I don't know how, I think it was 24, no, it was, I can't remember, but it was like $2 million for the party to hand out. Can you imagine 900 cars lined up in some, just finding the field for the party so that they could hand out the cars was a big logistical issue. So anyway, that's an example of an incentive system for the entire company. Now you might think $24 million and $50,000 cars, but you're talking about a company that went from $400 billion to $800 billion in value. Think about what that was to the stockholders. $24 million is a drop in the bucket. Most incentive systems at the organizational level will pay back about 5%. That's typically what the target is. And I'm not smart enough while I'm lecturing to figure out whether that was 5% or not. But I don't think it was. I don't even think it was close. But just an example of an institutional-wide incentive system. One of the things that is popular in institutional-wide systems is either stock ownership or stock options. That's easy for a company. They can just issue stock and hand it out to employees. And they can also own that stock. There are vesting issues, which we'll come back to. But that's an easy option for a company-wide incentive system, is to issue stock. If we make a certain benchmark in stock price or in oil and gas reserves or whatever, then we're going to issue so much stock to you, either for direct ownership in an ESOP or through a stock option. I'm going to come back and define those in a little while later in the chapter. Then finally, you have to ask yourself, are you going to do team-based? Or I talked about group-based, and group-based is nothing more than an organizational-wide pay-for-performance system, just for a smaller group. But a team-based system is different. In a team-based system, you really got to focus the outcome only on that team, and you've got to be able to handle the fact that most teams have high achievers and lower achievers, and those people all have to get along together. So not everybody contributes the same in a team, but the team will absolutely be paid based on what the outcome is. And then you have to deal with the free riders. So like I said, these systems are complicated. They're hard to run. Merit pay plans are basically distribution of pay based on the appraisal of a worker's performance. They're a variant, they're a type of, and a more common type of individual performance plan. We're now started into the individual plans. But a lot of companies have merit pay systems that if you get a high score on your performance appraisal, you'll get a merit pay increase. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of companies don't have very good performance appraisal systems. And so if you have a performance appraisal system that has a lot of leniency, remember what leniency was? It was a lot of people towards the top end. Severity is a lot of people towards the bottom end. And so if you've got a performance appraisal system that's not normally distributed, everybody tends to be at the high end, then it's really hard to give out raises because everybody's got a high score. If you cannot differentiate people, remember going way back, I think it's a selection, the goal of measurement is to differentiate people. And so if you haven't differentiated people because you've got a lot of leniency in your performance appraisal system, it's almost impossible to give pay raises on that because you don't know who the top 10% is. Another problem with merit pay systems that's really common is that the company will say, okay, there's a 3% merit pay increase this year, and they leave it up to managers to give that pay increase out, and all the managers give everybody 3%. Is there any pay based on performance in that when everybody gets 3%? The answer is no. And so it's not really a merit pay system. It's basically everybody got a 3% raise, cost of living. And so that'll kill a merit system in a minute. Employees want that link between performance and pay. If they don't see it, they won't believe in the system. Obviously, the managers aren't believing in the system for some reason. Either they don't have a good measurement on people's performance, or they haven't paid attention, or they're unwilling to play God and make distinctions between employees. There's lots of reasons. Most supervisors don't like to make those distinctions unless they have hard data to do it. That's where a true pay for performance system comes in and helps, because it really measures things very solidly, and that's what the managers want to have. If you do a merit pay system or a bad performance for reward system, reward for performance system, what that can do is cause high turnover in your high performance, high performers. If the high performers are not being rewarded commensurate to what they think they're contributing to the job, they're going to be unhappy. And if they're unhappy, they're going to leave. There actually is a model in Chapter 12 for what causes turnover, and one of the things that causes turnover is low job satisfaction. And so if your high performers are being dissatisfied because they're not being rewarded, they will leave. They will go to other companies where they perceive they are being rewarded for their good performance. The historically the oldest form of incentive pay is a piece rate system. If you go into a factory where people are making parts, or they're making clothing like underwear or T-shirts or whatever, and quality is easy to measure, then you can start paying people for how many T-shirts they turn out. And so basically it's the amount of T-shirts that you turn out minus the ones that cannot be sold, and you're paid on that. Where you find that is, for the most part now, internationally. Most of that kind of work in America has gone overseas. And so if you go to India or Honduras or the Philippines or a lot of different places, you will see factories that are turning out parts and clothing, and the workers are paid on a piece rate system. Piece rate systems have to follow all the rules of performance, pay for performance. The workers have to know how the system works. They have to know the outcome's measurable. They have to know how it's measured. They have to be able to calculate their own pay. All those things have to be involved in a pay for performance system. Another pay for performance system is sales incentive plans, and that's basically they're designed to increase sales over time. And the issue is that if you get to a certain level of sales, you get a reward. And earlier I gave the example of giving vacations and trips and that kind of thing. That's the typical kind of sales incentive plan, is that if you increase your sales by X amount or you meet a certain target, you will get a vacation in Hawaii or something like that. They also have Draw Plus plans where you're paid per performance, but that you can actually draw pay and borrow against that. Commission Plus for sales people do that all the time. You get a commission per sale, but an individual can actually take a kind of what looks like a set salary, and if their sales didn't come up to that amount, they're actually borrowing against their next month's pay. And so they draw the same amount, and as long as their sales stay above that, they're fine. They get extra pay the following month. One-time bonuses are an example of individual pay systems. The state of Texas this year paid a one-time bonus to individuals that were marked as being worthy of merit, and did not pay a long-term pay increase. If they added a pay increase, they'd have to pay that pay increase for every year forward. And this year, the state of Texas said, okay, there's X amount of money, you can give it out as a one-time payment, and that's what they did. Okay, let's move to group incentive plans. Group plans are best where people are very cooperative and there's lots of teamwork in the culture of the organization. They take a lot of special consideration. I already talked about the free rider effect, and group norms can really inhibit output. If you get a new employee that comes in who's really trying hard to produce extra output, the workers in that group setting will inhibit that person from performing, so that they don't upset the apple cart. They don't make everybody else look bad. So there's a lot of strange psychological things that go on in group incentive plans. And the biggest problem with group plans is meeting the Fair Labor Standards Act, and particularly for overtime and provisions. So again, you're going to have to make everybody a salaried employee. Now, you'll hear about profit sharing and gain sharing. Profit sharing is basically getting a reward based on the percentage of company profits. Employee payments are typically linked to some ratio in their pay, and that's linked to a percentage increase in companies' profits. Gain sharing is sharing financial rewards based on something like reduced cost or increased productivity. So I've talked about, when we're talking about the general issues of pay for performance, I gave you some examples, but gain sharing is where you've shared in some gain, or some reduction like cost, but you've reduced cost, or you increase productivity, or you increase profit, and so you get a percentage of that, or you get a reward for that. Where profit sharing, you get a percentage back, and gain sharing, you get a reward for it, like a trip or whatever. There, in your textbook, I want you to go in and look at this section on gain sharing, because there are 4 different approaches to gain sharing. The Scanlon plan is by far the oldest, the Rucker plan, the InfoShare plan, and Win sharing. So I leave it to you to go look at those and understand what the differences are. Scanlon plan is really rewards for suggestions on doing things. So there are different kinds of gain sharing plans, and you can go look those up. Scanlon plan, Rucker plan, InfoShare, and Win sharing. A lot of companies do gain sharing. It's fairly easy because you can tie it to cost or productivity or quality improvement, measurable things. Another thing that's a group plan that you'll hear about is, and I mentioned this earlier, is employee stock option plans. Employee stock option plans. An employee stock option plan is where the retirement plan, and in a retirement plan, a company contributes its stock to the benefit of all the employees in that company. And so the employees never buy or hold the stock directly. It goes into a pot that the company owns, and so the stock ownership plan, they're called ESOPs, ESOPs, is that the company puts stock in, but it goes into a pot that's owned by all the employees, and you don't get it until you quit. A stock option plan is where the employee individually gets stock, and under the vesting rules of ERISA, will own that stock somewhere either at 5 years or 10 years. You can vest at different levels. Most stock option plans don't vest for 10 years, which is the maximum vesting. You have to own your retirement at 10 years. But a stock ownership ESOP plan is that there's a pot and everybody owns it, and you don't get your piece of it until you leave. And a stock option plan is you get stock individually, and you may not be able to sell it, but in most cases you can. Most companies allow you, after a fairly short period of time, to move your stock. And one of the hints that I'll give you is, if you do get into a stock option plan, don't let your stock continue to sit there, continue to sit there, and continue to sit there. Sell it off, buy other stocks, because almost anybody in investments will tell you that you need to diversify. So don't sit there working for Ford and own nothing but Ford stock, because if Ford goes under, what's going to happen? You're going to lose everything. You will lose your retirement, and you will lose your job. So if you get stock, if you get a stock option, sell the stock. I mean, not immediately, but don't sit there and bet on your company, because you've got everything in one pot, and companies do go under. Okay, let's talk about managerial and executive incentive pay. Most executives get some kind of incentive pay. It's usually linked to net income or return on investment or total dividends. It usually is an increase regardless, but executive compensation it really has dramatic increases. I mean, there are lots of different ways to incentivize, and obviously one of them is stock option plans. But there are lots of others that you can double your stock if you meet certain criteria, or you can be paid more in cash at the end of the year if you meet certain outcomes. So one of the reasons that we have a widening pay differential or dispersion between executives and workers is all of those pay incentive plans for executives. There's not been a lot of research that really has looked at those gaps, but the gaps are getting bigger. Not a lot of research has really been looking at whether those incentives make managers better managers. There are lots of instances of failure of that. I mean, I mean, there's, I don't know, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but you can probably go back in the news reels for the last 5 years and find 10 companies where the executives had fairly sizable stock option incentives regardless of the performance of the company, and where the company was losing money, the stock was going down, and the boss was selling off his stock options and making millions of dollars while the employees were being laid off. And that, you know, from my point of view, it's not right. But stock reward options do not necessarily tie to the performance of a company. That's the problem with all incentive systems, with all pay performance systems. You've got to balance that short term and the long term. And a lot of executive pay does not. It's there regardless. It's basically paying somebody to come in and stay rather than to perform at a certain level. Managerial implications for pay for performance. It really should lead to low costs, but a lot of times they don't because they're so difficult to develop and control. It should lead to higher profits, higher quality, higher profits, lower cost, because you're paying people to do that. It should increase motivation of people. But the bottom line is that in any pay for performance system, the employees have to know what's measured. They have to know what pay it is tied to and how much. Any individual plan, an individual has to be able to calculate their pay at any time or they won't trust the system. It has to reward both the short-term and the long-term goals of the organization strategically. But the benefit is that you can use pay for performance to drive your strategy, and you should whenever you can. One of the things that you will have with employees is the need to get them to be responsive to your customers. One of the ways that you get somebody responsive to their customers is to reward them for doing that. Think about an entrepreneur who starts his or her own company. I don't care if it's a ma and pa, dry cleaners or donut shop to a company making $10 million a year. Those people that own that company are going to do almost anything to make that company profitable because their next bag of groceries depends upon it. And they're not going to be worried about, does the clock stop at 5 o'clock? They'll work 24/7. They're not going to be worried about anything but keeping customers satisfied and coming back and doing business with you. Well, that's the entrepreneurial model. If you go into most companies and you start paying people by the hour to show up and do work, and then you hire a bunch of managers to make sure they do the work, you've got a totally different system. You've got a system where the employees are paying attention to the manager because they're the one motivating them. They are not paying attention to their pay system particularly because they're going to be paid the same regardless. They're going to get a check every Friday or every month or whatever it is. They're paying attention to everything but the customer coming back and doing business with them again. And so almost all companies are trying to get the employees to be responsive to customers. The obvious way to get employees responsive to customers is pay them to be responsive to customers. Well, one, it's hard for a lot of jobs to do that. Nursing, for instance, is not tied to anything. A nursing charge is basically part of the room charge. Nursing is furniture, essentially. You get it when you come to the hospital. And so trying to incentivize nurses is difficult. Now, nurses tend to be very motivated to please the customer and keep the patient care going, and that's good. But to try to change their behavior, trying to change the system towards something other that's more customer focused is hard because there is no incentive pay. Now, changing physicians' behavior is very simple because they're basically small business people, and if they don't do what the managed care company says, the managed care company will stop paying them and they will go out of business and starve. And so you can see incentive system on one side and hourly pay on the other. But you are probably going to go into an organization, you might go into a physician practice, but you're going to go into an organization where you got a lot of employees paid by the hour. How do you get them to start focusing on the customer? Well, pay for performance, if you can define the performance, is one way to do that. And then, of course, you have to pay attention to the short term and the long term. You can't pay attention to the customer only because there are other things that need to be done. However, and another option is a mix of plans to do that. But the overall issue that I'm trying to get out here is that almost all companies are trying to incentivize their employees to be more customer focused, but yet their pay is not tied to what the customers do or don't do. And that's what an incentive system is trying to do. So most companies are trying to move towards pay for performance in some form, but it's very difficult. And any place you can do it, any place you can make a workforce look and act entrepreneurial through a pay system, you should do. Because that way you will get your workforce accountable to the patient. The problem is that even in the healthcare system, the patient doesn't pay the bill. The managed care company does. And so the patient probably only pays 20 to 35% of the bill. They don't pay it all. And so you've got to incentivize people so that they pay attention to the customer, who pays a third of it, the managed care company, who pays a third of it, and then someplace else that pays a third of it, which is usually some other procedure or some full pay procedure in a hospital. But you can see that your full dollar that's being made is coming from a lot of different pots. Try and incentivize that employee towards a patient or towards a managed care company is difficult because they're pulled all those different ways. And so you end up with a lot of people paid by the hour, and they're not paying attention to anything. They're not paying attention to the patient. They're not paying attention to the managed care company. They're paying attention to the boss because the boss is the one that hands them the check. So pay for performance is desirable, but it's very difficult to do. That's the end. Thank you. Read chapter 11.